I paid for a paranormal experience on the dark web. Now I can't get rid of it. Alright, so before you judge me, just know I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't even one of those people who believe in ghosts or any of that paranormal stuff. I just wanted to see what the dark web was all about, you know? Like, you hear all these crazy stories, and I thought they were mostly exaggerated. Turns out I was wrong. I was so wrong. It all started one night when I was bored, and maybe a little too curious for my own good. I'd been hearing about the dark web for years, mostly horror stories, sketchy stuff, illegal things. But people kept mentioning weird services you can find on there, like personalized experiences that go way beyond anything you'd find on regular sites. I wanted to see if it was real or just another internet urban legend. Plus, I thought it'd make a good story for my friends. Who doesn't love a creepy story, right? So I set up a virtual machine, turned on a VPN, and after watching a few tutorials on Reddit, I found my way in. The first thing I noticed was how low-key everything looked, like an old, shady website from the early 2000s. Nothing flashy, just plain black text on a grey background with links that didn't even sound legit. I mean, explore the unseen, forbidden curiosities, and the Black Bazaar. It all seemed fake, like it was trying too hard to be edgy. But then I stumbled upon a link that just said, "Experience the paranormal, guaranteed." It was simple, clean, no creepy symbols, no weird fonts. Just that sentence. I clicked on it without thinking twice. The page that loaded looked like an online store, but not the kind you're used to. Each item was listed with weird services like Spirit Encounter, Level 1, Possession Experience, and Haunted Object Rentals. The descriptions were bizarre but detailed enough to seem almost believable. Like someone had put real effort into making this stuff sound legit. I started scrolling, laughing a little at how far people would go to mess with others for a few bitcoins. But one listing caught my eye. Personalized paranormal experience, tailored just for you. The description was vague, saying something like, "For those seeking the unknown, prepare for a once-in-a-lifetime experience that will test your courage. Results may vary." It was only 0.2 Bitcoin, which was like a couple $100 maybe. Definitely more than I'd normally spend on a whim, but I figured it was probably some prank thing. Worst case scenario, I'd lose a bit of money. Best case, I'd have a spooky story to share. I clicked purchase and was taken to a page that asked me to fill out a form with details about myself. It wasn't anything too weird, just my name, age, city, and what I feared the most. I thought they were going to use that last question for some cheap scare tactic. I typed in dolls because, well, they creeped me out, and clicked submit. A message popped up saying, "Expect your experience to begin within 24 hours. No contact info, no refund policy, nothing, just that. The next day, I forgot about it for the most part. Went to work, got home, and didn't think twice. I even laughed at myself, wondering if I'd just thrown a couple $100 into the void. I kept telling myself it was all just a scam, and I was a fool for falling for it. But around midnight, things started happening. It was subtle at first. My lights flickered once or twice. My Wi-Fi kept cutting in and out. I just figured it was a power issue or maybe something with my router. But then my phone buzzed with a notification. I checked it, and there was a single email in my inbox. The subject line read, "Welcome to your experience." I opened it, and it was just blank. No text, no images, just a white screen. I figured it was a glitch, but something about it made my skin crawl. I closed the email, and for some reason, the silence in my apartment felt louder than usual. That's when I heard it, the soft, barely there sound of music coming from my living room. At first, I thought maybe a neighbour had their TV on, but it was so faint and off. The melody was slow, repetitive, almost like a lullaby, but warped and slightly out of tune, like an old record. I got up to check, trying to act casual, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I got closer, I realized the music was coming from my TV, which was off. I stood there, staring at the black screen, listening to the distorted tune coming out of nowhere. It felt wrong, like something was there, lurking just beyond the screen, watching me. I backed away slowly, not wanting to turn my back on it. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I felt like if I looked away, something would happen. I made it back to my bedroom and shut the door, my heart pounding like a drum. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, around 3 a.m., I got another email. This time, the subject line said, "Don't look away." I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I could still hear that warped lullaby creeping in from the living room. I kept telling myself I was just spooking myself out, that I was way too old to be afraid of a little static noise on a screen. But there was no shaking that feeling, the one that makes the hair on your arms stand up, like you're being watched. The next morning, I woke up, groggy, bleary-eyed, but desperate to shake off whatever bizarre experience I'd bought into. As soon as I stepped into the living room, though, my stomach dropped. My TV was on, but it was just showing static, an empty, snowy screen like something out of an old horror movie. I hadn't turned it on. In fact, I'd turned it off twice last night. I grabbed the remote, turned it off again, and waited, standing there in the dead silence of my apartment, feeling like an idiot. I didn't want to believe something paranormal was happening. It was just too ridiculous, right? This was 2024. TVs didn't just turn on by themselves, and I didn't buy into haunted tech or whatever. So I pushed it to the back of my mind and went about my day, trying to pretend like everything was normal. By evening, I was feeling a bit better. I had convinced myself it was just some electronic glitch. Maybe the power surge from last night had messed up the TV's settings. But as soon as the sun went down, that feeling crept back. My apartment felt colder. The shadows seemed a bit sharper, if that makes sense. Then my phone buzzed. Another email. Subject line: "Tonight's the night." I opened it, but again it was just blank. I didn't know if I should laugh or be scared at this point. I was starting to wonder if someone had hacked my phone and was messing with me. Maybe they were using the info I'd given in that creepy form I'd filled out. I mean, it made sense, right? Someone with too much time on their hands trying to freak me out. I could handle a prank. Then around midnight, my doorbell rang. Now here's the thing, I live in a small apartment building and people don't just show up unannounced, especially not that late. I sat up, trying to convince myself it was probably just a delivery guy at the wrong door or some drunk neighbor. But the doorbell rang again, long and steady, like whoever was out there knew I was listening and didn't plan on leaving. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the peephole. There was no one there. Just the empty hallway, lit by that dim, yellowish light that made everything look washed out and strange. I exhaled, feeling a little silly for how tense I was. But as soon as I let my guard down, the doorbell buzzed again, this time louder, like it was on the verge of breaking. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I just stood there, heart pounding, until the ringing stopped. Silence filled the air again, but it was that thick, oppressive silence, like the world was holding its breath. I leaned against the door, straining to hear anything, even the tiniest sound from the hallway. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper on the other side of the door. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded wrong. like a recording that had been played backward, a voice that was more static than sound, and it was getting louder, closer, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was pressing its mouth right against the crack in the door. Without thinking, I backed away, heart racing, and grabbed a chair to prop against the door. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe the lock to jiggle, maybe footsteps walking away. But the silence that followed was somehow worse. It felt like whoever was out there knew I was inside, knew I was terrified, and was just waiting for me to let my guard down again. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, made me jump. I kept glancing at my door, half expecting it to burst open. I knew it sounded paranoid, but there was no shaking that feeling, like I was no longer alone in my own home. Then another notification popped up on my phone, breaking the silence. I glanced down and felt my stomach turn. It was another email. Subject line, "Let us in." My heart raced as I opened it, half expecting it to be blank again, but this time there was an image attached. I clicked on it, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a photo of my front door, taken from the hallway. I could see my name on the door plate, the chair propped up against it. And in the photo, I could just make out a shadow standing to the side, almost hidden in the corner of the frame. It was tall, too tall to be any of my neighbors, and the shape was all wrong, distorted somehow, like it didn't quite fit into this world. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? What would I even say? I'd paid for a paranormal experience on the dark web, and now some shadowy figure was stalking me? They'd laugh me off the phone. I decided I couldn't stay in my apartment. I shoved a few things into a bag, keeping one eye on the door, and slipped out of my bedroom window. It led to the fire escape, and I figured I'd take the stairs down to the street. I didn't even bother locking up. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. As I crept down the fire escape, trying to make as little noise as possible, I felt that sensation again, the one that made my skin crawl. I was about 3 floors down when I glanced back up and nearly slipped. There, standing at my window, was a figure watching me. The shape was wrong, warped in a way that didn't make sense. Its head was tilted too far to the side, its arms too long, fingers pressed against the glass like it was testing the barrier between us. And its eyes, if you could call them that, were just dark, hollow pits, staring down at me with an intensity that felt almost human, but not quite. I bolted, stumbling down the last few steps and onto the street, not daring to look back. I spent the rest of the night at an all-night diner, trying to convince myself that I was just sleep-deprived, that it was all a hallucination brought on by stress and fear. But as dawn broke and I finally felt a hint of relief, my phone buzzed again. Another email, this time with just a single word. Run. By the time the sun rose, I was too shaken to go back to my apartment. I spent most of the morning pacing outside the diner, nervously clutching my phone and replaying every detail in my head. The emails, the shadow at my window, the eerie, warped lullaby. I kept hoping it was some kind of sick prank, a trick of my mind. But no matter how I tried to spin it, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't over. I thought about deleting my email account or throwing my phone in the trash, but I felt that would make no difference. This thing, whatever it was, felt connected to me now, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I checked my messages again, half expecting another email, but there was nothing, just that last one. Run. Against every instinct I had, I decided to head back to my apartment. I told myself I just needed to grab a few essentials and find somewhere to stay for a few days, maybe a friend's place, maybe even a motel. I just couldn't stay in my apartment, not after everything that had happened. So I made my way back, constantly glancing over my shoulder, every shadow in the alleyways and corners feeling like a pair of eyes watching me. When I finally arrived, my door was still shut, the chair I'd propped against it undisturbed. Everything looked exactly the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I entered cautiously, taking small steps, my senses on high alert. The air inside felt heavy, almost thick, as if something was waiting in the silence. I went straight to my bedroom to grab my essentials, but as I stepped inside, I froze. My window was wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I know I hadn't. The curtain billowed slightly with the morning breeze, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the room. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, trying to tell myself that maybe I'd just forgotten in my rush to leave. But then I noticed something else, an object on my bed that hadn't been there before. A small, old-fashioned porcelain doll lying dead center on my pillow. The sight of it sent a chill through me. Dolls freak me out, always have, but this one, there was something different about it. It was dressed in a worn, faded blue dress, with curly hair that looked brittle, like it would break if you touched it. Its eyes were dull, glassy and slightly chipped, staring up at the ceiling as if it were lost in some faraway place. I had no idea how it had gotten there. I hadn't bought it, hadn't seen it before, and I certainly hadn't left it on my bed. But the worst part, the part that made my blood run cold, was the piece of paper tucked into its tiny hand. I reached out, every instinct screaming at me not to, but I couldn't stop myself. I unfolded the paper with shaking hands and saw, written in small, childlike handwriting, "Tonight, you'll hear me sing." I dropped the paper, the words burning into my mind, and staggered back, fighting the urge to run. I didn't know if this was some kind of sick joke, if someone had broken in, but I couldn't ignore it. I needed answers, and at that moment I was desperate enough to go looking for them. I grabbed my laptop and opened it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I'd find some way to contact whoever had sold me that experience on the dark web. Maybe they could undo it, maybe they could explain what was happening. But as I scrolled through my emails, searching for the transaction confirmation, my screen glitched, distorting and flickering until the brightness hurt my eyes. A message appeared, filling the screen in bold letters. "We warned you. Don't look away." Then the screen went black. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the dark screen, my heart pounding so loud it was all I could hear. I could feel something building, a presence I couldn't see, but felt pressing in around me. Just then I heard a soft humming from the living room, the same tune as before, that warped, creepy lullaby. This time it was louder, clearer, as if it were coming from right outside my bedroom door. I didn't want to go out there, but I had to know what was happening. I crept down the hallway, my palms sweating, every step feeling like I was getting closer to something I couldn't understand. When I reached the living room, I stopped cold. The doll was there, sitting upright on my coffee table, staring straight at me. I hadn't touched it. I'd left it in the bedroom, and now it was here, as if it had moved on its own. The humming stopped, replaced by a long, drawn-out silence. My eyes stayed glued to the doll, its face frozen in that creepy, lifeless stare. And then it blinked. Just once, but enough to send me stumbling back, my heart racing. I watched in horror as its head slowly turned to face me, its glassy eyes fixing on me with a cold, unfeeling stare. It lifted its tiny porcelain hand and pointed, the motion jerky and unnatural. Then from behind me I heard it, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. "Let me in." I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. just empty air. I could still feel the presence, though, hovering right behind me, close enough that I could feel the chill radiating off of it. I ran, grabbing my bag and bolting out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to get out. I ended up on the street, barely able to catch my breath, my mind racing. I felt like I was losing it, like this wasn't just a haunting, but something far worse, something that wasn't going to stop until it had me completely. I ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, exhausted, my mind a foggy mess. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and huddled on the bed, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I kept checking my phone, expecting another email, but the notifications were blank. Just endless messages with no subject, like something was trying to reach me to break through. Eventually I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in total darkness. The motel room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels thick, almost unnatural. I fumbled for my phone, but as soon as I turned on the screen, a new message appeared. I found you. I heard the humming again, this time right outside my door. I couldn't move. The humming was just outside the motel room door, soft and eerie, floating through the thin walls. My body locked up, every instinct screaming at me to stay absolutely silent. I felt like a trapped animal, cornered in some place where no one could help. I held my breath, hoping that if I stayed still enough, whatever was on the other side of that door would just go away. But the humming didn't stop. It grew louder, almost as if it knew I was there, hiding, terrified. The worst part was that I recognized the tune. It was the same warped lullaby that had played from my TV, the same one that seemed to follow me. Except now, it sounded closer, clearer, like it was happening right next to my ear. Then, as suddenly as it started, the humming stopped, leaving an eerie, empty silence in its wake. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving back and forth right outside my door. I tried to think, to remember what I knew about hauntings or spirits or whatever this was, but nothing made sense. It felt personal, targeted, like something had latched onto me the moment I clicked purchase on that dark web page. I'd invited it in, and now it wasn't going to leave. I clenched my fists, feeling trapped, desperate. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but who would believe me? The police would laugh me off, and even if they didn't, what could they possibly do? It wasn't a person on the other side of that door. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. Just then, the footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, hoping it had gone, but my relief was short-lived. Slowly, almost hesitantly, I heard a faint tapping on the door. Not loud or aggressive, just a soft, rhythmic knock, like someone trying to coax me into answering. I swallowed hard, every nerve screaming at me to stay silent, but then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, muffled, but I could just make it out through the door. It sounded childlike, distorted, almost like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Please, let me in." I pressed my back against the wall, shaking my head, even though no one could see me. My heart was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears, but I didn't dare move. The voice repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. "I need to come in." I shut my eyes, willing it to stop, hoping this nightmare would somehow end. But the tapping continued, relentless, like it was trying to wear down my will, trying to get me to open the door, to let it in. Suddenly my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was so sharp, so out of place in that silence, that I nearly dropped it. I looked down, hesitating, then unlocked the screen. Another email. This one didn't have a subject line. Just a blank notification that shouldn't have been able to reach me, I'd turned off data, I'd disconnected from Wi-Fi, but somehow it had found a way through. I opened it, and there was just a single image attached. It was a photo of me, sitting right there on the motel bed. My face was half lit by the phone screen, eyes wide with fear. I could even see the reflection of the doorway behind me. But there was something wrong with the photo, something that made my blood turn to ice. In the doorway, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. The same shadowy figure I'd seen back at my apartment, tall and distorted, with those hollow, empty eyes that seemed to stare right into me. It was like it was waiting, lurking, as if this whole thing was a game, and I was just its target. I dropped the phone, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't stay here, I couldn't go back to my apartment, but running wasn't going to solve anything. This thing was following me, tracking me no matter where I went. And the thought of leaving just felt like another trap, like it wanted me to run, to let my guard down. Then, as I sat there, trembling, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I waited, counting the seconds, listening for any sign of movement. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, that maybe, just maybe, it had decided to leave me alone. But then, the bathroom door creaked open. I stared, unable to breathe, as a shadow slowly stretched across the floor, inching its way toward me. I didn't dare look up. I knew somehow that if I looked, if I acknowledged it, it would take that as an invitation. My hands shook, my skin felt like ice, but I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, hoping, praying it would just disappear. But then it spoke again, the voice closer, clearer. "Why won't you look at me?" The words were barely above a whisper, but they echoed through the room, filling every corner, every dark shadow, until it felt like the walls themselves were breathing. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm, but the voice kept pressing, relentless, like it could sense my fear. "You invited me," it said, almost reproachfully. "You paid for this." I wanted to scream, to shout that I hadn't known, that I'd been tricked, that this wasn't what I'd signed up for. But I couldn't get the words out. They felt trapped, frozen in my throat, as the shadow crept closer until it was right beside me. I felt a cold, weightless pressure on my shoulder, like fingers brushing against my skin. My whole body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The voice leaned in, so close that I could feel the chill of it. "Look at me," it whispered. I shut my eyes, holding my breath, willing it to go away, but the grip tightened, growing colder, sharper, until it felt like ice was burning into my skin. "Look at me," it repeated, firmer this time. I knew that if I turned, if I met its gaze, I'd be letting it in, opening myself up to whatever darkness it brought with it. But my willpower was wearing thin. Every second felt like an eternity, the cold sinking deeper, as if it was pulling something out of me, draining something vital. And then I heard a faint, muffled scream, my own. The grip released, and in that split second I opened my eyes. The shadow was gone. The room was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. I was alone again, but the air was thick, heavy, almost as if the darkness itself was watching me. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and saw one final message flash across the screen. "You can't run. We are with you now." And in that moment I knew, whatever I'd invited, whatever I'd paid for on that dark website, it wasn't something I could escape. It wasn't something I could hide from. It was a presence, a shadow, that had wormed its way into my life, into my mind. And no matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, it would always be there, waiting in the dark, just out of sight, waiting for me to look. The days that followed were a blur. I drifted between cheap motels, friends' couches, anywhere I could find. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. The cold presence, the quiet whisper at the back of my mind. It was never loud, never intrusive, but it was always there, like a shadow that stretched just a bit too far, lingering in the corners of every room I tried to hide in. I stopped checking my emails. Every time I looked at my phone, it would buzz as if taunting me. Blank messages filled my inbox, some with photos of me that shouldn't have existed. Photos taken from strange angles, like someone was standing inches from my face, capturing my fear. The last few times I dared to open them, they were just words, short and simple. "Don't run. We're here. Let us in." I didn't understand why it hadn't done anything more, but part of me felt like it was waiting for me to break, for my guard to slip so it could finally take over. The dull, the eerie messages, the humming, they felt like games, like it was trying to wear me down until I couldn't fight it off anymore. One night, after almost a week of constant moving, I finally broke down. I was exhausted, cold and numb, barely holding on. I'd rented a tiny cabin in the woods miles from the nearest town, thinking maybe, just maybe, it couldn't reach me there. As I sat there, staring at the empty room, I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. This thing, whatever it wasn't going to leave me alone. Not until I looked. I was done running. So I turned off all the lights, closed the blinds, and sat in the darkness, waiting. It didn't take long. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick, almost suffocating. I could feel it, pressing in on me, filling every inch of the cabin. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay still. I wouldn't run. I was done being afraid. Then slowly the room grew colder, an icy chill that seeped into my bones. I could feel it watching me, waiting. And then, as if it had been waiting for my acceptance, I heard it. The humming started, soft and eerie, filling the air like smoke. It was the same tune, that warped lullaby that had haunted me from the beginning. Only now it sounded closer, sharper, as if it were being whispered right next to my ear. I clenched my fists, feeling the chill sink deeper, until it felt like the air itself was pressing down on me. And then I heard the voice. "Thank you for letting me in." I didn't turn, I didn't look, but I could feel it, standing right behind me, so close I could feel the cold radiating off it. I stayed still, breathing slowly, trying to keep my composure as the presence leaned in, its voice soft and taunting. "You've been such good company." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. I was trapped in place as the presence circled me, its breath cold against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I felt its fingers graze my shoulder, a feather-light touch, almost playful, like it was savoring my fear. And then it leaned close, whispering directly into my ear. "Look at me." I clenched my eyes shut, my body shaking, but I couldn't hold out forever. The pressure grew, an unbearable weight pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The room seemed to close in around me, the darkness deepening until it felt alive, pulsing with that same sick energy that had haunted me since that first night. "Look at me," it whispered again, insistent, commanding. I couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, almost against my will, I opened my eyes and turned around. I can barely describe what I saw. It was a face, but it wasn't. It looked like it was made of shadows, an ever-shifting mass of darkness that almost resembled a human figure. But the eyes, they were hollow, empty, yet filled with something that felt wrong, as if looking into them was peeling away something inside me. It wasn't just looking at me, it was looking into me, reaching into places I didn't even know existed. For a moment, time stopped. The room disappeared. There was just me and it, locked in a stare that I couldn't break, couldn't escape. It felt like I was drowning, sinking into those dark, empty eyes as if they were pulling me in. And then it smiled. It was the kind of smile that wasn't meant for a human face, sharp, cold, stretching too far across that shadowed visage. It leaned in close, its face inches from mine, and whispered in a voice that sounded like it was echoing from somewhere far, far away. Now we're together. I don't remember much after that. Just a blinding cold, the world spinning, and then darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the cabin. The sun was rising, casting pale light across the room. I was alone, but I knew it was still there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows. I could feel it, a part of it inside me now, like a parasite that had burrowed its way into my mind. I left the cabin, drove back to town and went home, barely remembering the drive. I don't know why I came back. Maybe it was because I knew deep down that I couldn't outrun it. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always find me. It was a part of me now, something that would never let go. Every night I hear the humming, soft and distant, growing closer with every passing hour. Sometimes I see shadows moving in the corner of my vision, just a flicker, but always there. And every time I close my eyes, I feel it watching me, waiting for the moment when I finally break, when I finally look at it again. It's been weeks now, but I know it's only a matter of time. I don't sleep much. I don't eat. Every sound, every shadow feels like a warning, like it's reminding me of the price I paid. And every night, without fail, I get the same message over and over until it's burned into my mind. You let me in. I joined a dark web group tracking secret creatures held by the government. My town was on their map. I'm not the type to dabble in anything illegal or dark. Honestly, I only ever ended up on the dark web because of a dare. My buddy Sam, who is way more into creepy stuff than I am, told me one night after a few drinks that I'd never have the guts to poke around the dark web. We laughed about it, made some dumb bets, and by the next day, I had all but forgotten it. But a week later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself in some deep, murky corners of the internet that I never should have gone to. I started slow, mostly just browsing weird forums and private chat rooms. I wasn't looking for anything specific, honestly, just the adrenaline of being somewhere I knew I wasn't supposed to be. The usual stuff I stumbled across was as strange as you'd expect. Conspiracy theories, bizarre product listings, people trying to sell haunted items, you name it. But after a while, that stuff just felt like cheap thrills. I was on the verge of leaving it all behind when I received a message from a user with the name Eyes on You. The message was simple. You've been selected to join the group. Reply yes to this message to gain access. I remember staring at that message for a while, wondering if it was some automated bot or a prank. I didn't know what the group was, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But curiosity got the best of me again, and after a few minutes I typed yes and hit send. Within seconds, I was added to a hidden forum labeled The Watchers. The description was vague, something about keeping an eye on things that others pretend don't exist. I wasn't sure what I was getting into, but once I started reading, I was hooked. The threads were full of detailed posts about creatures supposedly held in top-secret facilities around the world, creatures the government didn't want anyone to know about. People in the group claimed they'd spotted these creatures, and they had maps marked with locations where they thought these sightings happened. Most of the posts were scattered nonsense, people claiming they'd seen Bigfoot or some mutant creature in the woods, but some of the posts, particularly those written by certain verified members, were oddly specific. There were GPS coordinates, photos, usually grainy and half obscured, and detailed descriptions of encounters that felt uncomfortably real. Then, late one night, I found a map that nearly stopped my heart. It was a user-uploaded document showing locations where the government supposedly held these creatures, marking places around the US and beyond. To my shock, there was a red dot right near my town. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe this was all just some elaborate joke. But as I looked closer, the map showed a location I recognized, a few miles from my house, out near the old lumber yard. That place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. People around here had a bunch of stories about it, classic urban legends. Some folks said it was cursed, others that it was just a dangerous spot kids should stay away from. But now, according to this map, it was marked as a government holding site for something, and it was classified as active. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in my house made me jump. I started thinking about all those rumors I'd heard over the years, all the weird things people had mentioned seeing near the yard, but I'd brushed off. Mostly people would talk about hearing odd animal sounds late at night, like something huge was roaming around. I'd always assumed it was just a wild animal, maybe a bear or a deer. But this made me question all of it. The next day, I couldn't shake the thought. I tried to go about my routine, pretending I hadn't seen anything, but it was no use. By the time evening rolled around, I was back on the group's forum, scrolling through threads, trying to find out more about these creatures, these facilities, and whether any of it could actually be real. That's when I stumbled on another post that made me shiver. It was from one of the verified users, and the title read, "If you're near an active red zone, prepare for visitors." The post was long and rambling, but the core message was clear. If you lived near one of these active zones, you needed to stay alert, especially at night. The user warned that people had gone missing around these areas, and those who lived to tell the tale reported seeing strange figures or hearing disturbing sounds. According to them, the creatures weren't always locked up in those facilities. Sometimes they'd get out, and people nearby would pay the price. A chill ran down my spine as I read through the comments. A few people shared their own experiences, waking up to find bizarre claw marks on their windows, hearing low, guttural growls outside their homes, even catching glimpses of something shadowy just beyond the tree line in their yards. The user went on to say that they would sometimes monitor the area after a creature escaped, and you'd start seeing people in plain black cars around town, watching, making sure nobody was looking too closely. By the time I finished reading, it was past midnight, and I could barely sit still. Every creak in my house, every gust of wind outside, made me feel like I was being watched. I finally gave in and double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows, something I hadn't done in years. But it wasn't just the thought of those creatures that scared me. It was knowing that people, actual people, could be keeping tabs on me, watching me without my knowledge. The following days were strange. I kept an eye on that forum, but I didn't post anything. I was too paranoid. I'd leave my house and notice things I'd never paid attention to before, like cars that seemed to slow down a little too much when they passed my street, or strangers I'd never seen in town before. It's a small place, everyone knows everyone. But now I felt like every face was a mystery, and every passing glance was a threat. About a week later, I came home from work late one night and noticed something weird. My street was eerily quiet. Usually you could hear the distant hum of cars from the main road, or the occasional bark from a neighbor's dog. But that night, it was dead silent. As I walked up to my front door, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced around, but nothing looked out of place. My lawn, my neighbors' houses, the darkened street, all seemed normal, if a little too quiet. But as I reached for my keys, I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a black car parked just a few houses down. At first, I thought it might be one of my neighbor's guests, but the longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. The windows were tinted, and there was no one visible inside, but something about it just felt off, like it was there for a reason, maybe even for me. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, and peered through my living room window, trying to see if anyone got out. Minutes passed, but the car didn't move. It just sat there in the shadows, as if waiting for something, or someone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just a random car. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a scratching noise at my window. It was faint at first, just a soft, scraping sound like a branch brushing against the glass. I sat up, my heart pounding, straining to hear. The scratching continued, steady and deliberate. I wanted to look, but every instinct told me not to. I pulled the covers up, holding my breath as the scratching turned into a low, rumbling growl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, guttural, almost like something trying to speak. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there in bed, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But the next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to look, I found thin, jagged scratches running across my window. They were deep and erratic, as if someone or something had dragged sharp claws along the glass, testing its strength. I wanted to tell someone, but who would believe me? "Hey, I think there's a monster from a dark web forum hanging around my house," wasn't exactly something you could bring up in casual conversation. So instead, I went back to the group. I scrolled through thread after thread, looking for any mention of signs, warnings, anything to explain what I'd experienced. One post caught my eye. A user claimed that these creatures weren't animals, they were something else, something that defied explanation. According to them, these beings could mimic sounds, even voices, and that's why the government kept them hidden. They didn't want people to know that these creatures could learn. They'd use whatever they picked up to get closer to people, lure them out, and once you were close enough, well, nobody seemed to know what happened after that. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My whole routine started to revolve around avoiding that dark, creeping sensation that someone, or something, was just out of sight, waiting. I stopped going out at night. I avoided my own windows. Even inside my house, I felt like I was never truly alone. A few days after the scratching incident, things got worse. I'd been on edge, barely sleeping, and decided to take a short drive to clear my head. But as soon as I pulled out of my driveway, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A black car creeping along behind me at a careful distance. It was the same kind of car I'd seen outside my house that night, with those dark, impossible-to-see-through windows. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. I mean, lots of people have black cars, right? But as I took turn after turn, testing to see if they'd follow, the car stayed on me, matching every move I made. I could feel the panic rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. I drove around town, taking random turns until I finally lost them near an old gas station. I parked there for a while, breathing heavily, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't want to go home. The last thing I wanted was to lead them back to my place, back to my door. So I waited until I was sure they were gone before heading back, taking every back road I knew, just to be sure. When I got home, the air around my house felt thick, like it was humming with some unseen energy. I walked inside, closing every curtain, double-checking every lock. But my mind was spinning. I kept picturing that black car, those dark windows, and the people, or things, that might be watching me from the other side. Then around midnight, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it and my stomach dropped. It was a message notification from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore something like that, but after everything I'd seen, I was too curious not to look. The message read, "Stop looking. You've been warned." My heart was pounding. I'd never given out my number on any dark web forum. I'd been careful about that. And yet, here was this message, directly addressing me, knowing exactly what I was doing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a scare tactic, maybe some hacker trying to mess with me. But deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, I decided to skip work and stay home. I was too rattled, too distracted to be around people. I spent most of the day pacing, checking the windows, waiting for something to happen. By evening, I was exhausted, emotionally drained. I finally dozed off on the couch, but my sleep was broken by a sharp, tapping noise. It was subtle at first, like someone lightly tapping on a window with their fingers, but it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart racing, straining to hear where the noise was coming from. Then I realized it was coming from my back door. I didn't want to go near it, but I knew I couldn't just sit there, so I grabbed my phone and crept down the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I got closer, I could make out a shadow outside the door, just beyond the frosted glass. It was tall, hunched, like someone standing awkwardly, with a head that seemed a little too large for their body. I held my breath, hoping it was just a trick of the light, some shadow cast by a tree or a passing car, but then it spoke. At first, it was just a low murmur, barely audible, like someone trying to form words but not quite managing. The sound was wet, garbled, almost like an animal struggling to imitate human speech. And then it called my name. I felt my blood turn cold. The voice was distorted, unnatural, but it was close enough to be recognizable, almost familiar. It was like someone was trying to sound like me, or like someone I knew, but failing miserably. I didn't respond, I couldn't, I just stood there, frozen, as the voice called my name again, drawing it out like it was testing the sound, trying to get it just right. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The shadow outside shifted, moved away from the door, and I heard a shuffling sound like something dragging across the ground. I wanted to run, to grab my car keys and get as far away as possible, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door or even look outside. When I finally gathered the courage to check, the thing was gone. But as I walked outside, I noticed something else, a trail of faint, muddy footprints leading from my back door down the driveway and into the woods behind my house. They were big, too big to belong to any animal I knew, and strangely misshapen, like they'd been made by something that didn't quite know how to walk on two legs. I stood there, staring at those prints, feeling my stomach twist with dread. That thing, whatever it was, had been right outside my door, calling my name in that twisted, mocking voice. And the worst part, I had no idea if it was coming back or if it was even gone at all. In a panic, I went back to the forum, desperate for answers. I posted a frantic message describing what had happened, hoping someone would respond, but when I refreshed the page, my post was gone, vanished, like it had never existed. I tried again and again, it disappeared within seconds. And that's when I noticed a new thread at the top of the forum, posted by the user Eyes on You. The title was chilling, "To the one who wouldn't listen." My hands were trembling as I clicked on the thread. The title alone made me feel like I'd been caught red-handed, like whoever, or whatever, had posted it was staring right at me through the screen. I didn't know what to expect, but the message was short and to the point. You've been warned. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. It was followed by a single grainy photo. I had to squint to make out what it showed, but once I did, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of my house, taken from the woods behind my property. In the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was a dark figure standing near the trees, its posture twisted, almost unnatural. I stared at that photo, trying to make sense of it. My mind was racing, running through every possibility. Was it a trick? Maybe one of those prank photos meant to freak people out. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was too specific, too targeted. Whoever had taken it wanted me to see it. They wanted me to know that they'd been watching, that they'd been close enough to reach out and touch me if they'd wanted to. I closed the tab, shutting down my computer. Every part of me wanted to delete the group, get rid of every trace of it, but I knew it was too late for that. The damage was done. I was involved now, and there was no getting out. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window seemed amplified, every rustle and whisper filling my mind with visions of that shadowy figure standing just beyond the glass. The next day I kept a low profile. I went to work, stayed quiet, avoided eye contact with anyone. But the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I got home, I locked every door, shut every window, pulled every curtain. I even moved some furniture to block the doors, as if that would make any difference if something or someone decided to come inside. Around 11 p.m, my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I picked it up, heart pounding, and saw another message from that unknown number. "Look outside." I froze. My instincts screamed at me not to do it, but something else, some part of me that couldn't let it go, pushed me to pull back the curtain just an inch and peer out. At first I didn't see anything. The street was dark, empty, as still as I'd ever seen it. But then, at the edge of the streetlight's glow, I saw them. Two figures stood there, barely visible, cloaked in shadow. They were tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that looked like they'd been stretched too far. They didn't move. They just stood there, facing my house, their heads slightly tilted, like they were observing me, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat. I let the curtain fall back, stumbling away from the window. I wanted to call the police, to tell someone, anyone, what was happening. But what would I even say? There are things standing outside my house. I could already imagine the disbelief, the awkward questions, the laughter. The minutes ticked by in silence, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, tapping, anything to signal they were getting closer. But there was nothing, just the heavy, suffocating silence. When I finally mustered the courage to look out again, they were gone. The street was empty, and I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe sleep deprivation was making me see things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I went back to the group's forum, needing to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. But when I logged in, I was locked out. My account had been banned, replaced with a single, final message on my profile. "You were told to stop." I stared at the screen, the words burning into my mind. Whoever these people were, they wanted me out. They didn't want me knowing any more than I already did. It was clear that I'd pushed too far, and now they were done with me. But there was one last thing I needed to know, something that had been eating at me ever since I'd seen those figures outside my house. I started a new account under a different name and scoured the forum, combing through every thread I could find. I was looking for anyone at all, who had seen these creatures and lived to tell about it. And then, buried in an old, archived post, I found something that made my blood run cold. The user had described seeing the same thing, shadowy figures with stretched, unnatural limbs, standing silently in the night. But it was what they'd written next that chilled me to the core. They're not there to scare you, they're there to make sure you keep quiet. If you see them, it means you know too much. I sat back, feeling the weight of that sentence sink in. The figures weren't just a warning. They were a final message. I was being watched, monitored, controlled. And if I said a word, if I breathed a hint of what I'd seen, they'd be back. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see them, those figures, standing at the edge of the streetlight, waiting for me to make a mistake. After that night, I tried to put it all behind me. I deleted every trace of the group, wiped my browser history, changed my phone number. I went about my days like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I stepped outside, I felt a pair of invisible eyes boring into me, tracking my every move. I'd glance over my shoulder on my way to work, eye every car that lingered a bit too long, avoid the woods near my house at all costs. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was only a matter of time before they'd come for me again. Then one night, a power outage hit my neighborhood. I was already on edge, but when the lights went out, every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I checked my phone, hoping to use its flashlight, but it was dead, despite being fully charged just minutes before. I sat there in the dark, surrounded by an eerie, unnatural silence. No hum from the fridge, no ticking of the clock, nothing. Just an oppressive, deafening stillness. I fumbled around trying to find a candle, a match, anything to cut through the darkness. But before I could light anything, I heard it again. That soft, scratching noise, like fingernails dragging slowly across glass. It was coming from the window in my living room, the one facing the street. I froze, my heart hammering, every muscle in my body locked in place. The scratching stopped, and then slowly, methodically, it started up again, louder this time, almost like it wanted me to hear, to come closer. Against my better judgment, I inched toward the window, not daring to look outside. My hands were shaking, my breathing shallow, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop, to turn back. But something pulled me forward, something stronger than fear, something that needed to know. I reached the window, gripping the edge of the curtain, and with a deep breath, I pulled it back. There, standing on my front lawn, was one of the figures. It was clearer this time, no longer a shadowy blur. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a pale, blank expanse, like a mannequin or something, only half-formed. Its body was twisted, elongated, arms hanging unnaturally low, its fingers impossibly long, curling and uncurling like they had a mind of their own. It tilted its head at me, as if curious or maybe mocking. And then, slowly, it lifted one of those long, bony fingers to its face, pressing it against where its mouth should have been. It was a gesture I didn't need to interpret, a silent demand for my silence, a warning. And then, as if to hammer the point home, another figure stepped out from the shadows, then another and another. They surrounded my yard, forming a ring of eerie, blank-faced watchers, all staring at my window, all with that same silent, unblinking command. I backed away, my legs shaking so badly I almost fell. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, waiting. I locked my door, though I knew it wouldn't do any good, and sat down in the middle of my living room, my head in my hands, heart racing. For hours, they stayed, unmoving, watching. I didn't dare look outside again. I stayed on the floor, hoping, praying that they would go away, that they'd leave me in peace. When the power finally came back on, I forced myself to check. I crept to the window and peeked out, half expecting to see them still standing there. But they were gone. My yard was empty, the street as quiet as it had always been. The only evidence of their visit was a single, muddy footprint on my porch, a twisted, inhuman shape pressed into the wood like a brand, a reminder. Since that night, they haven't come back, but I know they're still watching. Every so often I'll catch a glimpse of a dark figure in the distance, a black car parked just a little too long down my street. And every time I do, I feel that same chill, that same warning hanging heavy in the air. I don't talk about it. I don't visit forums, don't search for answers. I don't dare share what I've seen, what I know. I've learned my lesson, because they're out there, in the shadows, keeping their secrets, watching from the darkness. And if you get too close, if you push too far, they'll come for you, just like they did for me. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, and some things are meant to stay hidden. I found my own medical records on a dark website about government experiments. The records had things in them I've never told anyone, and they list procedures I don't remember having. Okay, so I guess it all started a few weeks ago when I decided I was going to take my deep dive into the dark web obsession to the next level. Look, I know it sounds stupid, and trust me, I wasn't looking for anything extreme. I'd just always heard these stories, seen the clickbait YouTube thumbnails, and I wanted to see if the rumors had any truth to them. I had zero intention of actually finding anything, let alone something that would completely flip my reality upside down. But, curiosity and all that. So I installed the Tor browser, messed around with a VPN, and set off. I wasn't expecting much, but I kept looking. Mostly it was disappointing forums talking about conspiracy theories that sounded more like bad horror movies, or random hitman pages that were so ridiculous I thought they had to be fake. Then I found something different. The link itself was buried in this obscure forum thread, and it didn't even look like it worked at first. Just a simple string of text that said, Government Project 13X. I don't know why, but I couldn't ignore it. Maybe it was the lack of any flashy graphics or horror aesthetics. There was just something cold, like it wanted to hide in plain sight. Anyway, I copied the link, pasted it in the browser, and after a painfully long loading time, the site finally opened. It was plain. A black background with a single login screen. No graphics, no logos, nothing. I thought maybe I'd hit a dead end, but then I noticed something weird. Above the login, there was this small text that read, "Access authorized for verified identities only." I almost laughed. What was I supposed to be verified by? I figured it was another one of those sites trying to lure you in, only to leave you locked out with some mysterious login screen. But then my curiosity got the best of me, and I tried typing in my name. Honestly, it was a total shot in the dark, and I almost closed the page as I typed it out. John Owens. Clicked enter. And it worked. The screen flashed, and a whole page of documents popped up. I was floored. Each document was marked with a serial number, followed by confidential, government property, and my name. At first, I thought it was some messed up coincidence. Maybe someone else with my name had gotten wrapped up in this creepy government site. But as I scrolled down, I started recognizing things, my birth date, my medical history, even small stuff like the chicken pox I'd had as a kid. What really got to me was this one entry at the top of the page. It looked like a doctor's note, dated exactly 6 months after I was born. It said, "Patient exhibits abnormal EEG patterns, potentially indicating early-stage experimentation effectiveness." Experimentation? Effectiveness? I had no idea what that was supposed to mean, but seeing that alongside my medical info, that set off alarm bells. I kept scrolling, my hands shaking as I skimmed more entries. There were dozens of them, spanning years, each one weirder than the last. Subject displays resistance to neurological interference, another one read, dated when I was about 5. What did that even mean? It was like someone had been tracking me, taking notes on my brain or body, and making a list of bizarre terms I didn't understand. All these experiments, though? I swear I had no memory of anything like that. By this point, I was way too far down the rabbit hole to just close the page. I mean, how could I? I kept reading, hoping to make some sense of the notes. But then I got to this one entry that made my blood run cold, even though deep down I was still trying to convince myself it was all a prank. This entry, dated back when I was around 10, read, "Memory alteration successful. Subject exhibits no recollection of initial procedures. Further observation recommended." Let me tell you, that felt like a punch in the gut. Memory alteration? No recollection. That was impossible. The thought that someone could have done something to me, then wiped my memory, sent me spiraling. But I couldn't stop reading. Every entry seemed to paint this picture of someone monitoring me, performing procedures, and then erasing it all from my mind. Then I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. One of the final entries was dated just a few months ago. The document was dated 3 months ago, almost to the day. It listed my name, age, and a few other random identifiers like my height and weight, but the line that got me was at the bottom. It said, "Continued monitoring required due to recent procedural failures. Subject displays mild resistance." Mild resistance? Procedural failures? I was just sitting there reading this line over and over, trying to understand what it could mean. As far as I knew, I hadn't been to a doctor in months, and the last time I had a checkup, it was just for a routine cold. But the entry wasn't just some random note. It was like someone had been actively trying to do something to me, something that hadn't exactly worked out the way they'd planned. I kept scrolling, half expecting to find something that would make it all click. But the more I read, the more surreal and unsettling it became. Most of the entries were filled with words and phrases that felt like medical jargon mixed with something darker. Phrases like neurological recalibration, memory dampening, and behavioral adaptation kept popping up, but I had no idea what they meant in this context. All I knew was that they were about me, my body, my mind. Then I found something that nearly made me slam the laptop shut. There was an entry from when I was around 16, labeled as Procedure 163, Anomalous Detection. The note below it read, "Subject exhibits signs of cognitive awareness beyond controlled limits. Emergency intervention necessary." Controlled limits? I had no idea what they meant by that. But as I kept reading, it seemed to imply that they'd done something to me, something they weren't supposed to. It was like I'd woken up in a way they hadn't expected, and they had to step in to reset whatever they'd done. But here's where it got weirder. I was reading one of these entries from about 3 years ago, and I realized that according to this document, I'd apparently undergone some kind of procedure in July of that year. And when I read that, I remembered something. Back in July 3 years ago, I was in the hospital. At least that's what my parents told me. It was strange because I had no actual memory of it. I only knew because my mum once mentioned it in passing, saying something about how I'd had some kind of fainting spell and needed to be observed overnight. But I remember feeling completely fine afterward. No lingering symptoms, no after effects. Just a day of my life that I couldn't account for, with no clear explanation. Suddenly that blank memory didn't feel like a coincidence. It was like I'd found this piece of a puzzle that I hadn't even known existed. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened in that hospital room wasn't what my parents, or maybe even I, had been told. And this document was the first proof that something had actually gone down, something that involved me. I kept reading, heart pounding in my chest, hands starting to sweat, as I scrolled through more notes that described my compliance levels, neurological patterns, and receptivity. None of it made any sense, but every word felt like a key to a locked door in my mind, like there was some part of me that was begging to remember whatever these people had buried. Finally, I got to an entry that didn't look like the others. It was more detailed, almost like an entire report, labeled as a summary of anomalous activity. I could barely read the words through the blurriness in my vision, but there was one line that made my heart drop. Subject displays a unique resistance to baseline recalibration. Hypothesis: genetic anomaly. It was almost like they were describing me as some kind of experiment, as if I wasn't just a random person they'd picked, but someone they'd been tracking, monitoring, and manipulating for years. And the worst part? I had no idea why. There was no clear reason, no explanation, just line after line of cryptic phrases and medical terms that seemed to strip away my identity and turn me into a project, a government project. And then, out of nowhere, a pop-up appeared on the screen. It was a chat window with a single message typed out in plain, bold letters. "Do you know what you're looking at?" I froze. The document was still open behind it, the endless entries staring back at me, but all I could focus on was that message. It was like someone was watching me, waiting for my response. I didn't even think. I just slammed my laptop shut and sat there in the dark, heart hammering like it was trying to escape my chest. I felt like a complete idiot. Of course they'd know. If this was some kind of government project, they would have tracked anyone trying to get into it. They'd probably been watching me the whole time, waiting for me to take the bait. And like an idiot, I'd done exactly what they wanted. But what was I supposed to do now? I had seen things I couldn't unsee, things that seemed impossible but were right there in black and white. And if they were watching, then they already knew that I knew. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing that single message, repeating in my head like some kind of warning. "Do you know what you're looking at?" I didn't respond. But now, as I sit here, the same question keeps running through my mind. Do I even want to know? The next morning, everything felt off. I woke up with this pit in my stomach, like the kind you get when you're convinced you're being watched. You know that feeling, right? You can't see anything out of the ordinary, but every sound feels too sharp, every shadow too deep. I felt like I was still trapped in that message. Do you know what you're looking at? Like it was stuck on repeat, echoing around in my head. Trying to ignore it, I decided to go through my day as normally as I could. But that illusion of normal barely lasted until breakfast. My phone dinged with a notification, and when I checked it, my heart skipped. It was a new email from some random address I didn't recognize, just a jumble of numbers and letters that looked like someone had smashed their keyboard. The subject line: "You've seen too much." For a second, I thought maybe it was spam or some random phishing attempt. But then I remembered the dark web document, that chat message, and suddenly I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all connected. Against my better judgment, I opened the email. The message was short, just a few words. "Your compliance is no longer guaranteed. Prepare for intervention." I stared at the screen, mouth dry, my heart thudding like it was trying to pound its way out of my chest. Intervention? What the hell did that mean? And how did they get my email? My real email, the one I'd had since high school, the one I'd only ever used for normal stuff, nothing shady, no deep web nonsense. I closed the email and tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was a prank. But then I started noticing other things, things that seemed small at first, but each one added to the gnawing dread in my gut. Like how my phone battery drained suspiciously fast, even though I hadn't used it much. Or how my laptop started running weirdly slow, even freezing sometimes for no reason. Every time I'd log in, it felt like someone else was in there, watching. I even tried to shrug it off, rationalizing it as some glitch, but it all felt too perfectly timed. Then came the faces. I started noticing people I'd never seen before, and yet they seemed to pop up wherever I went. At the grocery store, there was this guy in a dark hoodie hovering a few aisles away every time I looked. At the coffee shop, there was a woman who stared a bit too long, her eyes darting away the second I glanced in her direction. Once, I even saw a car parked across the street from my house, same black sedan, same tinted windows, and whenever I looked, it would pull away slowly, disappearing around the corner before I could get a good look at the license plate. I told myself it was just paranoia. After all, anyone could wear a hoodie or drive a black sedan. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. These people didn't feel like they belonged. It was like they were shadows cast from somewhere else, figures who were too perfectly timed, too silent, like they were barely there. Then one night, I was out walking my dog. Normally, it was just a quick loop around the neighborhood, something I'd done a million times without thinking. But as we rounded the corner near my house, I felt that creeping sensation again. I glanced behind me, and there, across the street, was the black sedan. This time, it didn't drive off. Instead, it just sat there, idling, with the faint glow of a phone screen visible through the windshield. My dog started barking, his gaze locked on the car, ears perked and alert. I tried to pull him back to keep walking, but he wouldn't budge, growling low, his hackles raised. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining it. Someone was there, watching us, waiting. Heart pounding, I yanked my dog's leash and practically dragged him back toward the house, glancing over my shoulder the whole time. And that's when I saw him. A man, wearing a black cap, stepped out of the sedan, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He just stood there, watching, not saying a word. I felt like a hunted animal. The minute we got inside, I locked every door, every window, pulled every curtain. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I went straight to my parents' basement and dug out an old baseball bat. The whole time, my mind kept replaying that single email line. Prepare for intervention. After that night, the shadowy figures seemed to grow bolder. I'd catch glimpses of them outside my window, see their reflections in shop windows. Even my friends noticed, asking why I looked so paranoid. I wanted to tell someone to explain everything, but how could I? Hey, I think the government has been running secret experiments on me my whole life, and now they're watching me. It sounded insane, like some half-baked conspiracy theory. One night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my laptop and tried to go back to that site to see if there was anything I'd missed, any clue that would explain what was happening. But when I tried, all I got was an error message. The site was gone. I tried every trick I knew, but it was like it had never existed. The documents, the entries, that chat message, they were all wiped. That's when it hit me. They weren't just watching. They were erasing, covering their tracks, making sure I couldn't prove a thing. The next few days passed in a fog. I was barely sleeping, always on edge, always glancing over my shoulder. I even started leaving my phone behind when I went out, convinced that somehow they were using it to track me. It felt like I was living in a ghost story where I was the only one who could see the shadows lurking around every corner. One night I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, mind racing, when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched whine, like a dog whistle, but lower, just at the edge of hearing. I sat up, heart hammering, straining to catch it, but as soon as I moved, it stopped. I waited, sitting in the dark, ears straining. Minutes passed. I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination until it started again, faint, persistent, and getting louder. It was coming from somewhere in my house. I crept out of bed, every instinct telling me to stay still, but something else, maybe that same horrible curiosity that got me into this mess in the first place, drove me forward. The sound led me down the stairs to the small closet under the stairwell where we kept the router, modem, and a mess of tangled wires. The noise was louder now, filling the small space with an unnatural hum. Slowly I opened the door. The whine was coming from the router, but there was something else. A small, blinking device stuck to the side. It was smooth and black, about the size of a quarter, with a tiny red light flashing in a steady rhythm. I had no idea what it was, but the sight of it made my skin crawl. I reached out and yanked it off, not caring what it might do. The second it came loose, the hum stopped, leaving a silence so deep it almost hurt. I stared at the thing in my hand, heart racing. What was this? Some kind of tracking device? And why was it in my house? I stuffed it into my pocket, mind reeling with 100 paranoid thoughts. Had they been tracking me this whole time, listening in? The realization hit like a punch to the gut. They weren't just watching me, they'd been inside my home. I threw the router out that night, terrified they'd find another way in if I kept it. But the damage was already done. I couldn't escape the feeling that no matter what I did, no matter how many locks I put on the doors, or how many times I checked the windows, they were already here, watching from the inside out. The next day, I found a handwritten note slipped under my front door. There were no names, no signatures, just 5 chilling words. "We're closer than you think." That note marked the point where everything took a turn from eerie to downright terrifying. Every noise in the house started to feel hostile. Footsteps echoing in the hall outside. I'd freeze, holding my breath until they faded. A knock on the door. I'd wait, barely breathing until whoever it was left. Paranoia became my constant companion, twisting every ordinary moment into a threat. The note was only the beginning. It was like they wanted me to know they were watching, that any illusion of control I had was a joke. Soon after, strange things started happening with my phone. Random messages would appear and disappear in seconds, too fast to read. Apps would open on their own. Once, while I was scrolling through my photos, I found one I hadn't taken, a picture of me, asleep in my bed, taken from right beside the mattress. The angle, the lighting. It looked like it had been taken only hours before I'd found it. The sheer horror of that discovery nearly paralyzed me. I tried to think of every explanation, every logical reason, but there was only one that made any sense. Someone had been in my house, standing right there beside my bed, holding my phone. Then one night, I heard something new. Voices. They were soft, barely a whisper, coming from the hallway. I crept toward the door, holding my breath, and pressed my ear against it. The words were muffled, but I could pick out bits and pieces. More increased resistance, recent complications, recalibration necessary. That was all I caught, before silence swallowed the rest. It was like a switch had been flipped, plunging the house into an even more oppressive quiet. My heart raced as I stood there, straining to hear something, anything, but the voices had disappeared as quickly as they'd come. That was when I realized something I hadn't considered before. They weren't just watching from the outside. They were here, inside my walls, lurking in places I couldn't see, listening to every breath, every whisper. They were in my life in ways I couldn't even begin to understand, pulling the strings like I was nothing more than a puppet in some twisted game. The idea hit me like a punch. Maybe they were here to remind me of something, to force me to remember the things I wasn't supposed to know. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, clutching my baseball bat, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. It was as if my entire life had been ripped open, every hidden part of me dragged into the light, exposed and manipulated by strangers. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was happening, whoever they were, I couldn't just sit around waiting for the next scare. I had to do something, anything, to try and take back control. So I packed a bag, grabbed my laptop, and drove hours out of town to a small, cheap motel in the middle of nowhere. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, left my phone behind, and paid in cash. The first night in that motel was quiet. I almost started to relax, thinking maybe I'd managed to get ahead of them, but that feeling didn't last. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a strange noise, a slow, steady beep. I lay there, too afraid to move, the sound getting louder and louder. Finally, I sat up and saw a red light blinking in the corner of the room. It was the same device I'd found attached to my router. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and ripped the thing off the wall. I don't know what came over me, but in a fit of rage, I smashed it to pieces, throwing it to the floor and stomping on it until nothing but plastic shards remained. I stood there, panting, staring down at the mess. And that's when I noticed it, a small slip of paper, buried among the broken pieces. I picked it up, hands shaking, and saw 3 words, scrawled in tight, messy handwriting. This is over. The next few days were eerily quiet. I stayed in that motel room, barely eating, barely sleeping, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But nothing happened. No strange messages, no shadowy figures outside my door, no more unexplainable noises in the middle of the night. It was like they'd finally given up, or like I'd passed some kind of test. After a week, I returned home. I expected everything to feel different, but it was almost like nothing had changed. My laptop worked fine, my phone wasn't acting up, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The black sedan was gone, and the strangers I'd seen before seemed to have vanished. But I knew better than to think it was really over. Whoever they were, whatever they'd done to me, I knew I'd never be free of it. They had stripped away pieces of my life, buried memories deep inside me that I might never recover. And for all I knew, they'd be back someday to start the experiment all over again. A few nights later, I was going through the emails on my laptop, clearing out old messages, trying to move on. I was almost finished when I noticed something in my inbox, a new message with no subject line. My stomach twisted as I clicked it open, expecting another vague threat, but it was just a single, short sentence. "You've served your purpose." I stared at the screen, feeling cold all over. Purpose? What purpose? But the email offered no explanation, no clues. Just that single, final line, leaving me with more questions than answers. Since then, life has been normal. No shadows in the corner of my eye, no strange devices in my home, no cryptic messages or emails. For now, it's quiet. But every now and then, I'll catch myself glancing over my shoulder or lying awake in bed, listening to the silence, wondering if they're really gone. And sometimes I'll wake up with this odd sense of déjà vu, like I've lived this moment before, but I can't remember when. Or I'll find myself thinking about something I don't recall ever learning, facts and memories that don't belong to me. In those moments, I feel like I'm still part of the experiment, like they're still out there, watching, waiting. Because that's the thing with shadows, they never really leave. They're always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. and I know one day they'll be back.